a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled within the warmth of a loving home, an innocent-looking Raggedy Ann doll sat on a shelf, its button eyes gazing out at the world. To the untrained eye, it was just a toy, soft, comforting, and harmless. But for those who knew the truth, the doll named Annabelle was far more sinister, far more deadly. It was the summer of 1970 when Donna, a young nurse, first received Annabelle as a gift from her mother. It was meant to be a charming addition to her apartment, a symbol of home in a city where she was still finding her way. At first, Donna and her roommate Angie were delighted with the doll, often admiring its quaint smile and nostalgic appearance. But soon, the atmosphere in their apartment began to change. It started with small things. Annabelle would be found in a different position than where she had been left. Her arms, which had been resting by her sides, would now be crossed over her chest. Sometimes she would be found sitting upright when she had been lying down. Donna and Angie dismissed these occurrences, attributing them to their own forgetfulness. But Annabelle had other plans. One evening, they returned home to find the doll had moved from Donna's bedroom to the living room. They were certain no one else had been in the apartment. The air was thick with unease, but they tried to brush it off, telling themselves that it was impossible for a doll to move on its own. But the fear had taken root. Then the notes began to appear. Small scraps of parchment paper, scrawled with childlike handwriting. "Help me," they read. "Help us." The notes were unsettling enough, but what made them truly terrifying was that neither Donna nor Angie kept parchment paper in the apartment. Where were these messages coming from, and who, or what, was writing them? The doll's behavior grew more aggressive. One night, Donna found Annabelle with drops of what appeared to be blood on her hands and chest. The blood was fresh, as if the doll itself had somehow been wounded or had harmed someone else. The roommates were now living in a state of constant dread, unable to sleep, their minds consumed with the horror that their once beloved doll had become a vessel for something evil. Desperate for answers, they reached out to a medium. The woman entered the apartment, her face pale and drawn as she connected with the spirit inhabiting Annabelle. The medium's voice trembled as she revealed that the spirit was that of a young girl named Annabelle Higgins, who had died tragically on the land where their apartment now stood. She was lonely, the medium explained, and had sought comfort in the doll. But this was no innocent child spirit. As time passed, it became clear that the entity within Annabelle was something much darker, something malevolent. The activity intensified. Doors would slam shut on their own. Strange noises echoed through the apartment at all hours, and the oppressive feeling of being watched never left them. One night, Lou, a friend of Donna and Angie, was sleeping on the couch. He woke up suddenly, frozen with fear. Annabelle was at his feet. As he stared, paralyzed, he felt a burning pain on his chest. When he looked, he found 7 deep scratches, 3 vertical, 4 horizontal, carved into his flesh. It was as if claws had raked across his skin. This was the final straw. Donna contacted the renowned paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, who immediately agreed to investigate. Upon entering the apartment, Lorraine felt a dark, sinister presence surrounding the doll. The Warrens knew that this was no spirit of a young girl. It was something demonic, using the guise of an innocent child to manipulate and torment the living. They took Annabelle into their custody, believing that it was the safest way to protect Donna, Angie, and anyone else who might come into contact with the doll. The Warrens placed Annabelle in a specially constructed glass case, designed to keep the demonic entity contained. On the glass was a sign that read, "Warning, positively do not open." But Annabelle's story doesn't end there. Even within her glass prison, she continued to exert her influence. One visitor, a young man, mockingly tapped on the glass and challenged Annabelle to do her worst. On his way home, he lost control of his motorcycle and was killed instantly. Those who have come into close proximity with Annabelle have reported feelings of intense dread, nightmares, and a sense of being followed by an unseen force. The Warrens would later describe Annabelle as one of the most dangerous objects they had ever encountered. To this day, she sits in her case, silent and still, yet the air around her remains thick with an unspoken threat. Those who dare to visit the Warrens' occult museum do so with a heavy heart, knowing that just a few inches of glass are all that stand between them and a force of unimaginable evil. And so Annabelle waits, her button eyes always watching, her painted smile hiding the darkness that lies within. The true terror of Annabelle is not just in the stories told about her, but in the fear that she might still be waiting for her next victim, biding her time until she can once again unleash her reign of terror. In the quiet suburb of Enfield, nestled within the heart of England, a dark shadow began to stretch over the Hodgson family home in 1977. It was an ordinary house, indistinguishable from the others on the street, yet something sinister lurked within its walls, waiting patiently to unleash its terror. The first signs were subtle, soft knocks on the walls, barely loud enough to be noticed. Peggy Hodgson, the single mother of 4, brushed them off as the usual creaks and groans of an old house settling. But soon the noises grew louder, more insistent, as if something on the other side was desperate to be heard. It was late one night when the horror truly began. Peggy's daughters, Janet and Margaret, were lying in their shared room, the air thick with the quiet of a household at rest. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a deafening crash. Their chest of drawers had moved, by itself, slamming across the room, as if an invisible force had taken hold of it. The girls screamed, their shrieks piercing the night, waking their mother who rushed into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. "What happened?" Peggy demanded, her voice trembling. The girls, eyes wide with terror, could only point to the heavy piece of furniture now blocking their door. Peggy tried to push it back, but it wouldn't budge, as if some unseen entity was holding it in place. Finally, with a tremendous effort, she managed to move it just enough to free her daughters. But the nightmare was far from over. Over the next few days, the disturbances escalated. Objects flew across rooms, doors slammed shut of their own accord, and the eerie knocking grew louder, more aggressive. The family lived in constant fear, their home no longer a sanctuary, but a prison haunted by something malevolent. Then came the voices. Janet, the 11-year-old daughter, began to hear whispers. At first they were soft, unintelligible murmurs, but soon they grew louder, more distinct, until one night the voice took control of her own. It was a deep, guttural sound, far removed from the voice of a young girl. "I'm Bill," the voice rasped through Janet's lips. "I died in this house, and I'll never leave." The family was paralyzed with fear. The voice continued, recounting details about the house that only someone who had lived there before could know. The voice claimed to be that of an old man who had died in the very room Janet now occupied. The torment was relentless. The voice would speak at all hours, mocking, threatening, and at times begging for help. The events became so disturbing that Peggy had no choice but to seek help. The police were called, and though skeptical at first, they too witnessed the impossible. A chair sliding across the floor on its own, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The authorities were baffled, unable to explain the phenomena, and soon, the press got wind of the strange occurrences. The Hodgson home became a focal point of paranormal interest, drawing investigators, skeptics, and curious onlookers alike. Among those who came were Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, paranormal investigators who were determined to uncover the truth. They set up recording devices, cameras, and other equipment throughout the house, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. What they found only deepened the mystery. The recordings captured Janet speaking in the same deep, gravelly voice, her vocal cords strained to their limit, yet doctors could find no physical reason for this transformation. Objects continued to move on their own. Furniture would tip over, and cold spots would appear in the air, chilling anyone who walked through them. On several occasions, Janet was witnessed levitating, her body suspended in midair as if lifted by an unseen force. The investigators were convinced that something evil had taken hold of the Hodgson family. But no matter how much they documented, how many hours they spent in that cursed house, they could not stop the terror. The voice, the poltergeist, as they called it, seemed to feed off the fear, growing stronger with each passing day. For nearly 2 years, the Hodgson family endured the haunting. Janet became the focal point of the activity, her body and mind tormented by the spirit that refused to release its grip on her. The once lively and cheerful girl became a shadow of herself, her eyes haunted by the horrors she had witnessed. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the haunting stopped. The voice ceased, the furniture remained still, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the house lifted. The family was left scarred, but grateful for the peace that had finally returned. Yet the question lingered. Had the spirit truly left, or was it merely lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to strike again? The Hodgson family moved on with their lives, but the memory of those terrifying nights never faded. The house, now quiet and unassuming, still stands as a testament to the horrors that unfolded within its walls. Even today, those who pass by can't help but glance at the windows, wondering if the spirit of Bill Wilkins is still there, watching, waiting, and ready to haunt again. Let me take you back to the early 1800s, to a quiet, unsuspecting farm nestled in the dense woods of Adams, Tennessee. It was here that the Bell family lived, an ordinary family on what seemed to be an ordinary plot of land. But what they didn't know was that this land was cursed, and soon, the most terrifying of legends would unfold. A legend that would become known as the story of the Bell Witch. It all began with a whisper. John Bell, the head of the family, first noticed it as a faint rustling in the dead of night, like the breath of wind stirring through leaves. But there was no wind. The sounds grew louder, closer, until they became unmistakable. A disembodied voice, whispering his name. John Bell. The voice was eerie, taunting, and it sent chills down his spine. But John, a man of reason, dismissed it as a trick of the mind. Soon, the whispers turned into footsteps, soft at first, then louder, heavier, echoing through the wooden floors of the Bell home. The family would wake in the dead of night to the sound of these phantom steps, pacing, prowling, as if something was walking just beyond their vision, lurking in the shadows. The children, especially Betsy, the youngest daughter, began to feel its presence. She would wake up screaming, claiming something unseen was pulling at her hair, pinching her skin, leaving bruises that could not be explained. But this was just the beginning. As the days passed, the entity grew bolder, its malevolence more intense. Objects moved on their own. Chairs would slide across the room, doors would slam shut with no one near them. And then the voice began to speak. It was a voice unlike any they had heard, deep and guttural, filled with a hatred that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. It mocked them, cursed them, and vowed to destroy them. The Bell family was now living in a nightmare. They turned to their neighbors for help, and soon the entire community knew of the hauntings. People came from miles around to witness the strange occurrences, and many did. They heard the voice, saw the objects move, and felt the icy presence that filled the air. The entity, which began to refer to itself as the Bell Witch, was particularly cruel to John Bell. It seemed to take a perverse pleasure in tormenting him, predicting his demise with a chilling certainty. John Bell, it would hiss, I will kill you. I will kill you, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. John's health began to deteriorate. He was plagued by strange fits and a mysterious illness that no doctor could diagnose. The witch continued to torment him relentlessly, its voice now a constant presence in the house. Betsy, too, was suffering. The witch tormented her with terrifying visions and violent attacks, forcing her to break off her engagement to a young man she loved. Then, one cold winter morning, John Bell was found dead in his bed. Beside him, a strange vial of black liquid was discovered. The witch's voice filled the house with a triumphant shriek. I gave old Jack Bell a big dose of that last night, and he'll never get up again, it cackled. The family, shaken to their core, knew that the entity had kept its dark promise. John Bell's death marked the climax of the haunting, But the Bell Witch was not done. It continued to harass the family, though less frequently, and always with that same malevolent glee. The house, now steeped in the energy of fear and death, became a place of dread. Over time, the hauntings subsided, but the legend of the Bell Witch lived on. The story was passed down through generations, each telling more chilling than the last. And to this day, in the quiet woods of Adams, Tennessee, people still whisper about the Bell Witch. They say that on a dark night, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint rustling in the leaves, the echo of footsteps, and the whisper of a voice that never truly left the Bell family's cursed land. And so the tale of the Bell Witch remains, a haunting reminder that some spirits are not bound by time or place, that some curses never fade, and that evil, once awakened, can never truly be laid to rest. In the quiet town of Gary, Indiana, there stood a house that looked no different from the others on the block. Yet, behind its ordinary facade, lurked a darkness so profound, it would come to be known as the Demon House. It was 2011 when LaToya Ammons, along with her 3 young children, moved into the small, unassuming home, hoping for a fresh start. But what awaited them inside was nothing short of a nightmare. It began with strange noises, footsteps echoing through empty rooms, the sound of scratching in the walls, and a foul stench that seemed to cling to the air no matter how hard they tried to rid the house of it. LaToya dismissed it at first, attributing it to the house settling, the wind, or maybe even the kids' imagination. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. One night, as LaToya tucked her children into bed, she noticed a strange, dark figure standing at the foot of her daughter's bed. She blinked, trying to convince herself that it was just a trick of the light, but the figure didn't disappear. Instead, it seemed to grow, its shadowy form stretching up to the ceiling, suffocating the room in darkness. She froze, unable to move or even scream until her daughter's terrified cry broke the spell. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of dread. From that night on, the house was no longer just a home. It had become a place of fear. Objects began to move on their own. Chairs would slide across the floor, and doors would slam shut with such force that the walls would shake. LaToya would wake up to find her children's beds levitating off the ground, their small bodies floating inches above the sheets, as if some unseen force was toying with them. The children began to change. Their once cheerful faces grew pale. Their eyes darkened with shadows that seemed to reflect the darkness lurking within the house. The most terrifying moment came when LaToya's youngest son was found standing in the middle of the living room. His eyes rolled back in his head, mumbling words in a language no one understood. His small body convulsed, his limbs twisting at unnatural angles, as if something was trying to break free from inside him. LaToya tried to pull him back, but he lashed out with a strength far beyond his years, throwing her across the room with ease. Desperate for help, LaToya turned to her church, seeking refuge in her faith. The church sent a priest to bless the house, but the moment he stepped inside, the temperature dropped and an oppressive silence filled the air. The priest's prayers seemed to have no effect, and as he sprinkled holy water around the house, he could feel the eyes of something unseen watching him, mocking him. The walls trembled as he continued, the house itself groaning in response as if rejecting his attempts to cleanse it. It was clear that what they were dealing with was no ordinary haunting. The priest recommended an exorcism, not just for the house but for LaToya and her children as well. Over the next few weeks, they underwent a series of exorcisms, each more harrowing than the last. The children would scream in agony, their voices distorted and unrecognizable, as if something else was speaking through them. LaToya felt as if she was being torn apart from the inside, her body and mind ravaged by the malevolent force that had taken hold of her family. Despite the exorcisms, the darkness in the house only seemed to grow stronger, feeding off their fear and suffering. LaToya knew they couldn't stay any longer. The house had become a prison, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had blurred beyond recognition. They fled, leaving behind everything they owned. desperate to escape the clutches of whatever evil had taken root in that house. But the story doesn't end there. The house, now abandoned, drew the attention of Zach Bagans, a paranormal investigator who had heard whispers of its terrifying reputation. He purchased the house, intending to document the strange occurrences that had driven the Ammons family away. What he encountered within its walls was beyond anything he had ever experienced. The air inside was thick with malice, and as he explored the house, he could feel the presence of something ancient and malevolent lurking just out of sight. Bagans documented his experience in the film Demon House, capturing the terrifying reality of what LaToya and her children had endured. He would later describe it as the most dangerous investigation of his career, a case that left him physically and mentally scarred. The house was eventually demolished, reduced to rubble in an attempt to erase the evil that had taken root there. But some say the darkness was not destroyed, only released, now free to roam and find a new place to call home. The demon house may no longer stand, but the terror it unleashed lives on. A chilling reminder that some places are not meant to be inhabited, and that sometimes the most terrifying things are not the ones we can see, but the ones that lurk in the shadows, waiting to strike. In the quiet mist-shrouded village of Klingenberg, nestled deep within the Bavarian countryside, there was a girl named Anneliese Michel. To those who knew her, she was a devout, kind-hearted young woman, her life dedicated to her faith and her family. But what befell Anneliese was a nightmare so sinister, so otherworldly, that it would haunt the annals of history and send shivers down the spines of even the bravest souls. It began with whispers in the night, an insidious murmur that only Anneliese could hear. The voices were distant at first, mere echoes at the edge of her consciousness, but they grew louder, more menacing, until they became an incessant cacophony in her mind. The doctors could find no cause for these voices. To them, it was a case of epilepsy, nothing more. But Anneliese knew, deep in her soul, that something far more terrifying was at work. Soon, the voices were not content with just tormenting her mind. They began to take control of her body. Anneliese would convulse violently, her limbs thrashing about as if puppeted by an unseen force. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, now darkened with an unnatural malevolence, glaring at crucifixes with a hatred that wasn't her own. She spoke in languages she had never learned, her voice deep and guttural, filled with venomous rage. Her family, devout Catholics, turned to the church in desperation. They were certain that what plagued Anneliese was not of this world. The local priests, however, were skeptical, believing it to be a case of severe mental illness. But as the months wore on and Anneliese's condition deteriorated, the evidence of something far more sinister became undeniable. One fateful night, as the wind howled outside and the moon cast an eerie glow over the village, the priests gathered in the Michel household. The air was thick with dread, and the shadows seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The first exorcism began. The moment the holy words were uttered, Anneliese's body contorted in ways that defied human anatomy, her screams echoing with a sound that could only be described as inhuman. She writhed on the cold stone floor, her voice a symphony of agony and rage, declaring in multiple voices that she was possessed by a legion of demons, each more ancient and vile than the last. "We are many," the voices roared, their words dripping with venom. "We have claimed her soul, and we will never leave." The exorcisms continued for months, each session more grueling, more terrifying than the last. The demons within Anneliese mocked the priests, taunting them with dark secrets and unspeakable blasphemies. They claimed to be Lucifer himself, Cain, Nero, Judas Iscariot, each name sending a wave of icy fear through the hearts of those present. Anneliese's body wasted away, her once radiant face now gaunt, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. She refused food and water, believing it was her divine duty to suffer, to atone for the sins of the world. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her bones protruding like the jagged edges of a broken doll. But despite her suffering, Despite the horrors that racked her body and mind, there was a strange, unearthly strength within Anneliese. She would sometimes speak in her own voice, begging for help, pleading for the nightmare to end. But these moments of clarity were fleeting, drowned out by the relentless tide of malevolent spirits that held her captive. As the final exorcism approached, the air in the room grew heavy with a suffocating darkness. The priests, worn and exhausted, gathered around Anneliese for what they knew would be their last chance. The rituals began once more, their voices shaky but resolute. Anneliese convulsed violently, her body rising off the bed, her eyes rolling back into her head as a guttural roar erupted from her throat. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Anneliese's body collapsed back onto the bed, motionless, silent. The room was eerily still, the only sound the ragged breathing of the priests. For a brief moment, it seemed that the nightmare had ended, that Anneliese had finally found peace. But when the priests approached her, they found her eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. She was gone. Her frail body, emaciated and broken, had finally succumbed to the relentless torment. The doctors who examined her afterwards could only shake their heads, noting that she had died of starvation, her body ravaged by the long months of exorcism. But those who were there, who had witnessed the horrors firsthand, knew that something far darker had claimed Anneliese Michel's life. The demons may have been cast out, but the cost had been her very soul. Anneliese was buried in a simple grave, but her story did not end there. To this day, her name is whispered in hushed tones, her grave visited by those seeking to understand the unfathomable. The trial that followed her death would spark a fierce debate between science and religion, between belief and skepticism. But for those who knew Anneliese, for those who stood by her during those long, harrowing nights, there is no doubt. The demons were real. They had come to Klingenberg, and they had taken Anneliese Michel with them into the darkness. And in the cold, quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, and the shadows stretch long across the ground, one might hear, just on the edge of hearing, the faint echoes of a young girl's desperate plea for salvation, lost to the ages, forever haunting the world she left behind.